Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about water bears and how they relate to some of the things that we've learned in our class so far and how they're great examples of how biology can be super cool and also very important. We are Isabella Banks, Audrey Casper, Lulu Herman, and Mira McPhee. To go over some of the facets of our presentation today, we're going to first talk about what are water bears and some of their cool, interesting elements about them. We're then going to be talking about the mitochondria in water bears, reviewing what mitochondria are in the first place, and also heat-soluble proteins within mitochondria. Then we're going to be talking about anhydrobiosis in water bears, what it is, and how water bears are able to survive it, making them very cool in their species. Then we'll talk about convergent evolution, and then we're going to be talking about asexual reproduction in water bears, particularly parthenogenesis.
All right, so water bears are basically indestructible microscopic creatures that are semi-aquatic, which basically just means they can survive on both land and water, and they're most commonly found living in moss in forests and also in oceans. Also known as tardigrades, there are more than 1,300 known species today. Their bodies consist of only around 1,000 cells, which is very small when you look at the human body that contains trillions of cells. They can survive for up to 60 years, 30 of which can be without food or water. And they can survive these periods by curling up into their tons. And they can also survive in both salt and fresh water. And they are known as nature's pioneers because they are able to provide food for larger creatures. And they're also known for their ability to survive through extreme conditions that would most likely kill many other organisms. So for our first iClicker question, are water bears able to survive in the dry periods? True or false? True. So for our second iClicker question, how long can tardigrades survive without food or water? A is 1 month. B, they cannot live without food or water. C, 30 years, or D, 60 years. The answer is C, 30 years.
Okay, next, before we jump into what the mitochondria in tardigrades have that is super unique and super cool, we're going to go over a bit of mitochondria in case you've forgotten. So mitochondria are double membrane bound organelles that produce ATP during cellular respiration. Basically, they're responsible for orchestrating cellular energy production. The common saying that a lot of people learn in like middle school biology or in high school biology is that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, which means it's a really important organelle. And in order for tardigrades to survive these conditions, they need their mitochondria functioning, which is what we're going to cover next. So the mitochondria obviously central to life. It's the home of the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which is illustrated on the right. This is a manner by which ATP is produced in cellular respiration. So for the third iClicker question in this slideshow, it's what organelle generates the most chemical energy to power cellular respiration? A is the Golgi apparatus, B is the peroxisome, C is the chloroplast, and D is the mitochondria. If you said mitochondria, you are correct. If you were thinking chloroplast, you might have been getting yourself confused with some photosynthetic processes, but mitochondria is what we're talking about today. So the mitochondria in water bears are super interesting and specific because they contain 2 types of heat-soluble proteins. And these proteins, a lot of research has been done that they may possess protective roles that play part in their indestructibility. And actually a recent study just did one looking at how they can be used to protect human cells, but that's not what we're talking about. That's just a tangent. So the names of the proteins are RV, LEAM, and MAHS, which is mitochondrial abundant heat soluble. So to be heat soluble, that means that a protein is going to remain in the solution when it's boiled, whereas most proteins would denature, aggregate, and then precipitate out of the solution. And so these proteins protect the mitochondria from damage in high temperatures, meaning that they can survive a lot of different conditions because of the way that these proteins are structured and how they're able to protect the mitochondria, which protects obviously the functions that the mitochondria does, which, as we said earlier, are essential for life. So this is just a graphic that illustrates some of the experiments that have been done using RV-Leem and in the tardigrades. So this image demonstrates basically that the heat solubility of RV-Leem. So S, which you can see right here, is the starting point. So this is just like basically the control, like what you see. HS is the heat soluble portion of RV-Leem, and HP is the insoluble precipitate of RV-Leem. So the band for heat soluble, the HS portion, is so much stronger than the band for the insoluble component. So you're able to understand how the majority of the protein, though there are parts that precipitate out, it's a majority heat soluble protein, which means that it's going to protect the mitochondria in really high temperatures. So our fourth eye clicker question: heat soluble proteins do not denature or aggregate, which allows them to perform their proper duties in water bear mitochondria because blank determines function. A is formation, B is structure, C is shape, and D is bonds. If you said structure, you would be correct, because as we've talked about a lot in this bio class, structure determines function, and without the proper structure, it's not going to function correctly.
So next, we're going to be talking a little bit about how water bears are able to survive without food and water for so long. So the process of desiccation is the removal of moisture from the body of an organism, which is something that water bears can experience and still survive. And so scientists for a long time have been wondering how they're able to stay so strong in these conditions, and particularly the condition of anhydrobiosis, which is life without water. For example, water bears have been able to go to space and have had no food or water, but yet when they're introduced to water, it'll take about 10 minutes for them to start acting themselves again and to be completing some biological processes. For a long time, they thought that this mechanism was because of trehalose sugar, which is a sugar that's found in sea monkeys or brine shrimp, which allows them to be protected in these conditions of anhydrobiosis. But it seems like there's going to be something else that is explaining this. Particularly, what explains this is tardigrade-specific intrinsically disordered proteins, or TDPs. When scientists disrupted these genes that produce TDPs during anhydrobiosis, the tardigrades no longer survived the desiccation. So this hints at the fact that these particular genes are what are allowing the water bears to survive for so long. So the way that these work are that they create a glass-like coating that keeps the molecules inside of the tardigrade cells intact without actually disrupting the whole system in general. So the cells can still metabolize even in the absence of water, which makes it extremely useful for outliving some of these harsh conditions that would otherwise kill them. So for my eye clicker question, which of the following mechanisms help water bears survive anhydrobiosis? A, the production of TDPs, B, the production of trehalose sugars, C, the inhibition of trehalose sugars, or D, the inhibition of TDPs. If you answer the production of TDPs, you are correct. So this is pretty interesting when you think about how this is a clear example of convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is when organisms that are not closely related to each other independently evolve similar traits. So we see that these sea monkeys have been able to develop trehalose sugar, which is partially a part of the water bears, but not their main mechanism, are very similar to these TDPs that are involved in water bears. And so we have some of these structures on the right. So we see the trehalose sugar and also the TDPs and how they've impacted both of them. So it's very interesting when you think about how all of these different life forms are trying to survive the same conditions and yet are going about it in a different way. For the last question, what signifies that this trehalose molecule is a sugar molecule? A, the multiple hydroxyl groups, B, the presence of sulfur atoms, C, glycosidic linkages, or D, two or more of the above? The answer is D, two or more of the above. So we see that we have these hydroxyl groups, which is characteristic of a sugar, and also this glycosidic linkages between two glucose molecules because it's a disaccharide.
Water bears have a very wide variety of reproductive strategies that differ depending on what species, along with what habitat they reside in. Scientists hypothesize that organisms like water bears living in isolated and unstable habitats evolved such various methods of reproduction to adapt to their harsh living conditions. The most common method of reproduction in water bears is parthenogenesis, which is a form of asexual reproduction in which eggs can become embryos without being fertilized by sperm cells. Water bears can also reproduce sexually, but that is very much more rare. It's important to remember that males do exist, but mainly in areas that allow significant contact with females, but taking that into consideration, for the purpose of this lecture, we will focus on the asexual aspect of generating offspring. Individual female bears will either lay mature eggs or deposit them inside their exoskeleton, which they shed during molting. The number of mature eggs typically range from 30 to 40, depending on the species, as well as the nutritional status of the female parent. The reproduction is aided by passive dispersal of eggs by the environmental conditions that they live under. The eggs that are laid freely have several protective characteristics, such as defensive structure, water reservoirs, and they can anchor onto substrates within their environment for more added protection. Once the egg matures and hatches, young water bears will leave fully formed, resembling the adults, and then they will continue to grow by cell enlargement. It's important to note that temperature has been shown to affect the rate in terms of survival and development, which would then impact the generation time and how much offspring they're able to reproduce. So here I listed some key findings of a study done on water bears in the Arctic region. The species that they cultivated in the lab produced by what is known as Thylakotis parthenogenesis, which basically means that only female offspring were generated from the unfertilized egg. There are different forms of parthenogenesis that can be used, such as automixis, which is basically the meiotic maturation of egg cells, or eptomixis, which is when the egg fuses with the derivative of the polar body to become mature enough to hatch. And lastly, parthenogenesis permits rapid increase in population size under suitable conditions, but obviously limits genetic variability because of its asexual nature and how offspring will be genetically identical to the parent. So one of my first clicker questions is what is true regarding asexual reproduction? I'll give you a minute to think about that. And two above are correct. So it was kind of a trick question because I wanted to emphasize that although parthenogenesis is considered a form of asexual reproduction, it is not the only form of asexual reproduction. So the two that are correct are B and C. A gamete does not need to be a part of asexual reproduction, as we see with binary fission and fragmentation and stuff like that. And then my second clicker question is, which factor has the least impact on the reproduction of water bears in terms of their ability to generate offspring and the amount of offspring they generate? And the factor that would have the least impact based on what we learned so far is the amount of male individuals present within the population, because the major form of reproduction is asexual.
Okay.
So that is what we have for you today. We hope that you learned a lot about water bears, specifically about their mitochondrial function, asexual reproduction, and anhydrobiosis in water bears. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know.